Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers webinar, Stop the Rot, Scouting and Sampling for root rot and pulses, pardon me. Welcome. Thank you to everyone for attending. My name is Meagen Reed, and I'm an Agronomy Manager with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and I'll be your host for the webinar today. For those of you who are joining us live, if you provided a CCA number at the time of registration, you will receive credits for today's webinar. This is being recorded, so be sure to watch for an email from SPG with a link to access the recording afterwards. The format for today's webinar will be first a video that we filmed last June out in the field west of Saskatoon. This will be followed by a live question and answer session hosted by our other agronomy manager, my colleague, Mike Brown. For today's webinar, we will be using Slido, which is an interactive tool that allows you to ask us questions and participate in live polls. Please follow the steps on the screen to access Slido. You can open a new window on your computer, phone, or tablet and enter the URL slido.com. Then enter the event code 2881069 and click Join Event. When we launch Slido in a poll, you will be able to participate under the Poll tab of your Slido window. At the end of today's presentation, there will be a live question and answer discussion period. So if you have any questions, please type them in that Q&A tab in Slido. And feel free to add your questions at any point during the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send us a message using the Slido Q&A tab, and we will assist you there. So before we get started and start the video, let's try some practice polls. So question 1. What pulse crops do you grow or advise on? So now you can please log into Slido and answer our poll question. We'll give this a few minutes for everyone to answer and also get signed up and logged into Slido. Seeing lots of pea growers, lentils, or pea acres, I should say, which is great. For those of you who are just joining, if you can follow the steps for logging into Slido and participate in the poll, that would be fantastic. Okay, there might be some people still answering, but the percentages haven't really changed much, or the splits. So 88% peas, 67% lentils, 30% chickpea, 20% faba bean, and then we have smaller portions of soybean, jar bean, and fenugreek. Still some people participating. Okay, the next question is, what percentage of pulse acres do you deal with that are affected by root rot? So we have some different ranges there. Okay, fairly even splits here again that are coming in. Few more people. If you haven't responded to this question, if you can, please. Okay, these values haven't changed very much. Roughly 37% up to 25% of the acres. There's some that are not sure as well, but I think that's a fairly accurate representation. But without further ado, let's start our video. So scouting and sampling for root rot pulses. This video is roughly 20 minutes, which we'll watch together and then follow up with our live Q&A. Hi, my name is Meagen Reed and I'm an agronomist with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and I'm here with my colleague, Mike Brown.
Hi, I'm Mike Brown. I'm also an agronomy manager with the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers.
We're here today standing in a lentil field to talk about general lentil staging and also to identify and talk about some management pieces when it comes to Aphanomyces and other root rot complex diseases. We're going to go through how do we identify and approach the field, what observations we can make from the field edge, and then move through identifying on individual plants and also talk about how to sample for plant and soil samples to aid growers and agronomists in their Aphanomyces and root rot management practices. Okay, so Mike, we're standing here in a lentil field. Let's talk about how do we approach the field from the field edge, because your lead crop is lentils and one of my areas is root rot. So as we're standing here approaching the lentil field, what would be some of the first things that we see or want to make observations about?
Yeah, so in this field you can see we're right near field entrance here. We're going to see a little bit of compaction where vehicles, equipment starts coming in. A little bit more difficult for roots to establish. And then as well as you can see just behind us, a little bit of a low spot. So water collecting off the hill towards this side of the field. You're going to get a lot more of the spore load and inoculum germinating, as well as moving along in that soil water. So we can see, you know, some of the yellowing, and then as it moves up the hill, greening up. So something you want to look for right when you approach the field is scout out those low spots.
Yeah, and I would second that. So as we approach the field from the field edge, what I like to do is, like you just said, come up to the field, even drive the whole length of one side or another side, and try to get a good visual overall impression of how the field looks and identify if there are any low spots like we're seeing here, where you can see these yellowing off areas. Particularly in this Rosetown Regina heavy clay, we're seeing lots of that compaction areas really starting to pop off with symptoms of root rot visually. Can you walk us through the lentil stage, the crop stage for this lentil crop?
Yeah, so this crop, it's in about that 10 leaf to 12 node stage. So it's pretty far advanced. We're near the end of June here. This would be plants that came out of a relatively healthier area of the field, so higher up on those elevations. But you can see that even some of those plants that look like they're healthy are starting to show some symptoms of root rot starting to develop. And then we can see the lower areas still in that 10 to 12 leaf and node range, but the size of the plants are starting to be affected. Some stunting there, as well as some of that root rot starting to happen, pinching off of the lower roots, caramelization, typical of Aphanomyces. And then when we start to see these really, really severe areas of the field getting affected, so areas that are in the lower spots of the field, maybe higher compaction at the field entrances or the tire tracks that the drill went through, you can see that those plants are severely stunted, even though they're at the same stage as the healthy plants in terms of leaf and node, and the roots are just poorly developed, pinching off, not a lot of nodulation. So we have a lot of different levels of disease in this field.
Yeah, so I'll speak to that a little bit more here. So what we're seeing, is Mike did a nice overview, is that when we're approaching a field for Aphanomyces infections, and that's really my wheelhouse, lentils is your baby, For both of us coming into a crop, or any agronomist or grower who's seeing these patches emerging in their field, starting to yellow off at this time of year, you know, we're at 10 node, 12 node. What we want to look for is you want to dig those plants up. And so go into these low spots. You really want to target those low areas where water runs. And then when you pull up plants, what we're looking for is that honey brown caramelization coloring that Mike talked about. And so on these plants, we're seeing pinching off. And so when we talk about root rot, it's really a complex, right? Like we have a number of different pathogens that are involved in root rot complex. We always go back to Aphanomyces as the lead, but in that root rot complex, obviously Aphanomyces, but then we have Fusarium species, we've got Rhizoctonia, we've got Pythium, and a number of other lesser known pathogens. But what we're really seeing here is some Rhizoctonia pinching off higher up on the hypocaudal, maybe some Pythium where there's this browning, and then lower down where there's absolutely no nodulation or secondary root development and just stringy, underdeveloped roots that are honestly not transferring any nutrients or water up to the above ground plant parts. So we've talked about Aphanomyces, that honey brown root that we're really looking for, that caramelization and no nodulation, no secondary root hairs. What would we be looking for if we were trying to identify if there's Fusarium present?
So Fusarium, you'll see a little bit of a blackening kind of at the soil surface on the hypocaudal, and reddening or red line forming in the cortex of the root. So a way to see if there's Fusarium in the field would be to break open the root and look at the center of it and see if there's a red line in the cortex. Now, all of the plants I've looked at in this field so far haven't had any of that reddening, haven't had any of the blackening on the hypocaudal either. So I'd be hard pressed to say that there's a lot of Fusarium in here, likely some, but not much that we can find for visual identification.
Yeah, and so I would agree. From the plants that I pulled, I wasn't seeing any distinct Fusarium of that blackening of that hypocaudal at the soil surface. One thing that when we talk about Aphanomyces and Fusarium species is that Fusarium actually activates under high moisture conditions, tight rotations, and then that oospore has to have a host there, so we have our lentils present. But also the optimal temperature for the oospores to germinate is in the mid-20s. Whereas Fusarium species, correct me if I'm wrong, we tend to see the Fusarium set in when it's cooler and moist, right? So earlier in the season, we really see Fusarium avanaceum take off. And this is why we kind of call it a complex as well, is that sometimes we don't know whether it's the Fusarium that sets in first or the Aphanomyces, and then we have, at this time of year, in a position where, does this grower spray fungicide or not? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, you're bang on with that. Fusarium kind of kicks the door down and Aphanomyces walks right in after. So in terms of a fungicide, it's tough to tell. You can't just go and pick out the bad spots in the field. You don't want to let your eyes wander and glue to those areas. You want to take the field as a whole and understand, you know, how much of the field's affected. Mm-hmm. Are you looking at a small 5% area of just your low spots? Are you looking at more of a 70-30? And then from there determining what your yield potential is. So do you have 70% of the field still going to pull a nominal yield, or are you looking at you're going to take a big hit from the root rot and not much yield's going to come off the field? So taking that into consideration, doing some scouting in the field, get an idea, are those healthy plants really healthy? You know, we saw there were a few healthy plants here that are showing early signs of root rot. So, you know, we get a few more rains and some wet weather, it might continue down that path, it might not. You know what your field looks like and know what the yields are going to be and whether or not it's going to be economical to apply a fungicide.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a really good way to approach it. And I think back to that, getting a really good picture of the whole field and traveling, you know, more than just coming in on one entrance like we have here today, but traveling down the whole west or north and south sides, get a picture and then walk in. Okay, so if we were to approach this field for this typical timing, we're looking at possibly herbicide efficacy, as well as maybe our first pass on fungicide. We're 10 to 12 node. How would you approach this field if there wasn't root rot present?
Yeah, so we'd be going in, doing a W pattern scouting, looking at areas in there, determining, how's the herbicide efficacy, what type of weed escapes are we looking at. In this area of the province, we're notorious with some Group 2 wild mustard, so something to definitely look at here. As well too, staging for fungicides. So if it's been rather wet, humid, warm, you may be looking at some earlier fungicide applications before flowering, depending if disease is starting to set in, namely anthracnose is the big one. But a lot of the fungicide labels will say spraying at just early flowering and before canopy closure. But yeah, W pattern throughout the field, looking at highs, lows, and mids. But when we're looking at root rot scouting, where would we go for that? What type of patterns are we looking at there?
Yeah, so if I walked into this field and we're clearly seeing this type of pattern where our low areas are standing out with some yellowing off, I would, if I was going to adjust my scouting pattern, like you said, still doing a W, I would like to do a transect on a W, M, or Z pattern, or whatever letter you want to pick. But I would target those low areas to get an understanding of how severe it is, first of all. If there is any nodulation, any root development at all in those areas. And then I would also still target some of those higher slope areas like you already talked about to see how far up that goes. And sometimes with root rot, and particularly Aphanomyces, it is water mobile. So it can, if we have enough soil moisture and we're at field capacity, Aphanomyces, oospores, and zoospores can move through the soil water profile and move with the hydrology of the field. So there have been lots of fields where I've seen in pea crops further north where you have a side hill that is completely deadened off from root rot infection, and the basin or the low spot in the field is beautiful green and has great nodulation. So it's really important to get a good understanding of where the water's flowing and follow kind of that pattern. Hit those spots where you see the hydrology is really standing out with this typical yellowing off and stunting, and then also go beyond that and still sample or take a look at those areas that are looking really good, like our hilltops here in this field. That's how I would adjust it, to still get a good overview of the whole field and try to make an estimation like you talked about before. Is it we're spraying a fungicide? How severe is the root rot? And what's the next management step we have to take from here? When we talk about root rot, particularly Aphanomyces in this area, what kind of rotation are most guys on?
Usually in this area of the province, lentils are pretty popular. They're looking at probably a wheat, canola, lentil, or something like that. So we're probably into about a 3-year rotation in a lot of these areas. It's really good soil, but when we talk about Aphanomyces and its longevity in the soil, you know this all too well, 8-year rotation may not even be enough depending on when that previous crop of pulses was grown, if it was a susceptible host in a very wet year. So 2016, very wet year. We're now 7 years past that, and we're even seeing some fields on that 7-year rotation that were very wet in 2016, showing symptoms of Aphanomyces root rot still.
Yeah, so 2016, like Mike said, really, or like you said, really heavy inoculum, really wet soils that year. A ton of Aphanomyces inoculum was produced, it germinated, set spores, and those resting spores, those oospores, are really long-lived. So in this area, typically 3 to 4 year rotation on lentils, not uncommon. In the last 10 to 15 years with wet weather from 2010 onward, we have now transitioned into 6 to 8, and some guys I think are even in a 10-year rotation. I know further north in some of my pea fields, I have guys that are 10 plus years on peas, because peas and lentils are equally susceptible for Aphanomyces root rot. And all we need is that host crop present, the soil moisture, and the inoculum present in the soil.
Yeah, and we talk about some of these tight rotations sometimes too, and we, short memory here, 2021 in the drought year, we had issues with potential for Group 2 carryover. A lot of those lentil fields from 2021 that had Group 2 applied handcuffed some of those producers, and they had to grow lentils on lentils. So things like that is something to consider as well too when you're planning future rotations, in that a buildup of 2 years in a row of lentils could be a pretty heavy inoculum pressure for down the road.
Yeah, that's something good to keep in mind. This field in particular, I think when we talked to the grower, he said that he's looking at 8+ years now on this field, particularly for a lentil rotation. So the next time he'll be able to grow lentils will be 2031.
Okay, Meagen, so we've gone through some of the symptomology and the scouting for Aphanomyces. How do we do some plant sampling if we want to get some confirmed diagnostics on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with your scouting pattern, I would follow the same scouting pattern that we already talked about, your Z or your W or your M. And if you want to know if you want to confirm whether you have Aphanomyces root rot or not, or Fusarium species or whatever diseases within that complex, I would go to those low areas like we're here right now, compacted areas particularly where you're going to have a higher prevalence of root rot, and dig up the plants. And then you would knock off as much of the soil from the roots as you can. The less that goes with it, the better. And if you're taking whole plants, take everything that you can take, all of the roots that you can get, the whole plant, and have a paper bag. We don't want plants going into plastic bags because they will sweat and they will rot. Put them in your paper bag and then label it accordingly with the grower's information, just like you would any other plant sample that you're sending away, either for herbicide or for tissue testing. Label with the grower's information, the land location, seeding date, all of that relevant information, and then send it to a commercial lab that has the capability to do DNA analysis, qPCR extraction for Aphanomyces identification. And lots of commercial labs are available to do that in Saskatchewan and particularly in Saskatoon. Next, if we wanted to just do a soil sample, I would, again, go to the same areas of the field and dig up soil from in row, particularly next to the plants. You don't want to have any root material in those in that soil, but grab about no more than 6 inches. So I'm going to show you my soil knife here. It's a little dirty, but this is a 0 to 6 inch knife, and we want anywhere from 0 to 6. Ideally, it's 4 inches from in furrow that we want to capture, and you want to get enough so that you've got 2 cups of soil minimum that you're going to put, and that actually can go into just a Ziploc bag. If you don't have any actual bags from the lab, put it into a Ziploc bag and then into your cooler, also labeled into a cooler with an ice pack, and put both of those in to keep them cool so that they don't sweat and the microbial community doesn't go and do a whole bunch of wacky things if they're sitting in a warm bag in your truck. The one thing that I would request though, when you're submitting that soil sample in particular, is whatever commercial lab you go to, whether they have it listed on their website or not, ask if they do a soil bait test. And that's really important because we're finding that it's very hard to extract DNA or oospore, zoospore DNA from Aphanomyces from bulk soil, particularly dry bulk soil. And so a soil bait test is different because what happens is they take that soil that you've collected, they put it in a pot, they get it up to field capacity, and they plant a little lentil or pea seedling in there. Then they put that pot with the seedling in it in an incubator for 7 days, and then they take the plant out and they extract the DNA from the roots of that seedling. And so it's a host, we put the host seedling in there, and that's called a bait test. And we're finding that we're getting much better results confirming disease. So I think you and I can both say that this field, we know that there's Aphanomyces here, but if we wanted to confirm that for the grower to help him make decisions next year or in future years, we want that confirmation. I highly recommend asking for that bait test because it actually has more accuracy, and more times than not where we know it's just a confirmation, we're having those results match up rather than a dry bulk soil test, which honestly they've been pretty inconsistent so far.
Okay, so after we get the results from the lab on whether or not we have Aphanomyces and whatever numbers they can give us, what can producers and agronomists use those numbers for?
Yeah, that's also the next piece. So right now we really only have a yes or no. There is a threshold of about 100 oospores per gram of soil that's been established, but we still have a lot of work to do with when it comes to soil analysis and soil testing for Aphanomyces. When it's just a plus or minus, yes, we have it, no, we don't, and it's a confirmation, like this field, for example, that grower and agronomist is going to have to use that information or will be able to use it to do rotation management planning going forward. So we talked to the grower here, he already knows he's likely on an 8-year rotation. If we tested and confirmed, that would just solidify his decision making for that lengthening out of his rotation. So when it comes to all of the different management practices, rotation is actually the biggest tool that we have right now when it comes to managing root rot in our peas and lentils. Well, thank you for watching our video and joining us in the field today. If you have any more questions or need more information on root rot management, Aphanomyces, and how to make those management decisions for your farm or for your growers, please check out our website at saspulse.com. You can follow us on social media. or you can contact us directly. Our information is also on the website. Thanks so much and good luck this season. Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with us and watching the video via the YouTube link. It looks like it worked great. I was able to watch it myself, so that was fantastic. We will now begin our Q&A session. If you were unable to completely watch the video or if you were still experiencing some technical difficulties, we will be sending the link out so you can watch the video after the Q&A via email. So you will still have an opportunity to watch the video, but we will move into our live Q&A session now. And my colleague Mike Brown is going to join me here. Please, if you haven't already, connect via Slido, and the instructions are in the chat, which has been enabled in the Teams event. Please ask questions within the Slido forum. Your questions will be anonymous unless you add your name. Mike, I'm going to hand things over to you so we can move on to the question and answer period.
Great, thanks, Megan. First question we have here, I guess everybody can see this now too. We mentioned that Fusarium infection can open the door to Aphanomyces. Is this a normal progression? Does a healthy plant reduce Aphanomyces incidence?
Yeah, so we talked about that in the video. It's really looking at the life cycles and the optimal conditions for each of those disease or those pathogens to germinate and release spores and infect the plant. So depending on the weather conditions, depending on the soil conditions, typically our Fusarium species do tend to occur a little bit earlier in the season. Fusarium species in general tend to have slightly cooler conditions that they will activate under. Some species are right in the same temperature range as Aphanomyces. But because we don't always know which disease sets in first, we can have it. They occur so often together at the same time and in conjunction, and it's very difficult to tell which one was the first one. It's just like when you or I get sick, get a little bit of a sniffle. If I go outside with wet hair and I have a sniffle, I can get pneumonia. And which is really causing the bigger issue? Was it the cold or the pneumonia? So because they occur so commonly together, we call them that complex. We don't always know which one sets in first. That was a bit of a generalization, but some of our Fusarium species do tend to have earlier or cooler conditions that they activate under. And so that's why we typically see, we want those seed treatments on there. We want control for Fusarium. And then if that plant is injured already by the Fusarium, Aphanomyces can just walk right in. And as I think Mike said in the video, kick the door down and stroll on in. Does a healthy plant reduce Aphanomyces incidence? Just like you or I, being healthier will help us fight off any type of cold, sickness, or disease. So you want to build resiliency in your plants as much as possible. So I would say generally, yes, it can.
I'd probably say that's probably one of our best options in fighting root rots if you're going to be growing a pulse, is to have the most vigorous, healthy growing plant you can.
Yeah, I would agree.
Next question here. Mentioned that oh, right, I'm reading the wrong one. Under the understanding foliar fungicides not effective against root rot diseases, video made it seem as though there's potentially an advantage. So you'd be correct in that understanding, I would say. Their foliar fungicides aren't going to work on a underground a pathogen there, but I guess that was probably where we were discussing the staging and timing for fungicide applications. So I'll let you take the rest of that one.
Sure. Yeah. So the part of the video I think you're referring to was the part where we were discussing what are the next management steps. So if we have root rot, there's the question of, is it severe enough? How do we assess whether that infection is bad enough that it's not worth spraying for foliar fungicide? So it's really, how does root rot impact the next management decisions that you will be facing in season? There's, like Mike said, there's no foliar fungicide that will do anything for root rot. Absolutely none. It is a root. Yes, it's a root disease. It's root pathogens. Going and spraying a foliar fungicide will not mitigate or stop the infection if it's already there and present. It's just oftentimes that the prime optimal time for conditions for Aphanomyces zoospores to germinate and infect the plant are about the end of June. The weather conditions and soil conditions typically occur towards the middle to the end of June. So our susceptibility is really high at that point, and that's about the same stage that we are considering, is it time to look at spraying a foliar fungicide? And that's what we were discussing in that portion of the video. Is it worthwhile for this grower to spray? Will the root rot take the crop? Is there any yield to try and salvage and keeping that crop as healthy as we can?
Yeah. Okay, next question we have here. I guess we can probably kind of take both of these questions because they're kind of similar. So what are some recommended pulses to put in rotation to prevent the root rot having a host, and which pulse crops are resistant to root rot?
Yeah, so we have using an alternative pulse crop in rotation is a really nice way to keep your rotation diversified. And again, like you said, not having that host is really important to not continuing to build that inoculum. So faba beans and chickpeas are resistant. Dry beans, there are some susceptible strains, there are some resistant strains. I think that Mike's our dry bean expert, but the type of dry beans we grow in the province are resistant, correct, Mike? The black bean that we grow typically?
For the most part, yeah.
For the most part, yeah.
Really haven't seen any yet, but yeah, like you said, market class differences between dry beans and even varietals. So yeah, it's something to consider that it's not a complete non-host compared to like a soybean, right?
Yeah, and then our non-host crops would be soybean, fenugreek, and lupin as alternative pulses.
I guess that's which pulse crops are resistant to root rot. Soybean has other root rots outside of Aphanomyces, right? So they're not,
yeah.
They're not there's no pulse that's really resistant to all root rots. It's just Aphanomyces is our big one that we want to consider susceptibility of those other pulse crops. Is the break in crop rotation between growing susceptible crops 8 years or 6 years? Seen both in print and presentations.
And I think I said 6, 8, and 10 years in the video that we did as well. So there's a caveat to this. It's very dependent on your growing area, your soil quality, your texture, your compaction, the amount of moisture you have, the frequency of previous pulse crops in that rotation, and how severe the root rot infection was the last time you grew a pulse crop on that field. So there's a number of different contributing factors that can compound together, resulting in needing to lengthen out the time between your lentil or pea crops from 6 years being okay to having to go to 10 years. In the video, we were near Rosetown, we were south of Rosetown, and that grower had been on a 4-year rotation. He had lengthened it out to 7 years. The day we were in there, we confirmed after that he needed to go to at least an 8-year, if not longer, because the last time he had grown lentils was in 2016 when the conditions were optimal to having a root rot infection, and he did confirm that he did see some levels of infection that year. So like I said in the video, there are some pea growers that I've worked with in northern Saskatchewan around Spiritwood. They're on a 10-year rotation for peas. Parts of the province where it's drier, lighter soil, not so much heavy clay, they can get away with 6 years on a lentil rotation. It depends on how often you had a host crop that was infected previous and what the conditions are when you're putting that pulse crop in next time. So when we talk about the sampling, either plant tissue testing or soil bait testing, that's a really good diagnostic way to see and confirm what your levels are, if there's a yes, no for a fano. Also, there's other rotational management tools that we have available as well that you can utilize to try and figure out what the risk is for going 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, or if you need to go longer. And that's one of them is the area app. So Aphanomyces risk evaluation app developed by Dr. Steve Shirtliff. It's an online forum. You can go in, find your field, and it will give you a risk assessment based on your crop insurance data and previous weather history data. So it's a really nice tool. And we have resources that we'll send you, we can send out after this as well, that has an assessment sheet to help make those decisions.
Yeah. Next question we have here, are there any forage legumes that are non-hosts to Aphanomyces?
Yes. So let me just pull this up here. So we have, just looking at this here. So alfalfa has a variable resistance to it, or variable susceptibility. So it is not totally resistant. It can still be susceptible. Sainfoin is resistant, so similar resistance that you would see in chickpea or faba bean. And if you're looking at forages, Sicer milk vetch is susceptible. So if you have Sicer milk vetch, sorry, it is as susceptible as pea or lentil. So I would look at considering maybe an alfalfa, or if you're really worried about it, looking at sainfoin as a actual resistant forage pulse for that land.
Okay. The next two here, kind of both dealing with seed treatments, so we'll combine them. Are there any seed treatments that can prevent root rot? And maybe I'll even, spread that out between, Fusarium, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, and then Aphanomyces. Any breeding strategies looking at finding and bringing root rot resistance to lentils? That'll be an exciting one to answer. And and how effective are seed treatments for the root rot complex?
Yeah, so I'll tackle seed treatments first. There are a number of products on the market that have suppression of I'm going to start with Aphanomyces. That's really the big, bad, ugly one that we're talking about a lot today. So Aphanomyces is the one that we really don't have any control products for at all on the market. We have suppression only. So there's products like Intego, Rancona with Belmont, I think Zelterra Pulse. There's a number of different products. I'm not going to name them all. Most of them all of them are suppression in low risk situations. So in fields where the risk is low and the conditions are not conducive to a root rot infection, using that seed treatment will suppress that Aphanomyces infection for the duration of its efficacy. So seed treatment efficacy is anywhere from 28 to 35 days after seeding. So once that seed goes in the ground, your efficacy clock starts ticking. If that seed treatment wears off and a week later you get a 4-inch rain and it's on land that has had, some disease issues in the past for root rot, you can still get a debilitating yield-robbing infection from Aphanomyces. So that's why it's, when we have all of the different parameters of the yield triangle, or the disease triangle satisfied, your host, your environment, and the pathogen present, seed treatments are not going to prevent that infection from happening. They can help get your crop off to a really good start. And I think that's maybe what you're leading me into, Mike, with the other pathogens within the root rot complex. So Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, Pythium, our seed treatments are also, they're also very good at controlling and suppressing those diseases, those pathogens. Lots of the products on the market have control level activity on those pathogens. The problem again is if we get conditions that are conducive to those diseases setting in after the efficacy of that seed treatment has worn off, you are susceptible, that crop is susceptible to a root rot complex infection. Because the treatment will only be effective for as long as it's actively cycling through the plant, and that's about 28 to 35 days, depending on the product. The next question was root rot resistance in lentils via breeding, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there are a number of researchers actively working on this. We have a lot of investment and money going into breeding resistant or partially resistant cultivars in both pea and lentil. Dr. Sabina Beniza from the U of S and Dr. Tom Workentine and Dr. Shama Chatterton and Michelle Hubbard and a number of other researchers are all working together to screen both lentil and pea genetics, and they are actively working on it. I cannot tell you a release date for a resistant cultivar today, but there is a large proponent of our research dollars going towards resistant varieties.
Yep. And then following up on the resistant varieties and breedings here, how do we expect those new varieties with some resistance to Aphanomyces to affect necessary years between host crops?
Oh, that's a bit of a ball of wax. I want to lob this back to you, Mike. So when we're
I mean, for
talking
me,
about,
I was going to say, for me, it's an easy answer, right? We don't know yet.
yeah, it is. We don't know
Yeah,
yet.
I mean, lots of development for it. So I'll let you go.
Yeah, there's a lot of implications with this. Right now it's looking like there's potentially that we won't have complete and total resistance built into these cultivars when they do get released. So what that looks like once we go to commercialization is largely unknown. Ideally, in a perfect world, I would hope that we would be able to, have a more regular rotation on peas and lentils as we've seen in previous to Aphanomyces rearing its ugly head. So 3-4 years on rotation, but that also means that we are relying on those genetics to be resistant and resilient to not breaking down under pressure from Aphanomyces zoospores or zoospore infection. So kind of like if we think about it the way that we're looking at clubroot resistance in canola, there's going to be some work around how do we maintain these genetics and not have them break down, because it's taken us so long it will have taken us so long to get those genetics in place. We want to preserve them as much as possible. So that's largely yet to be seen. I'm hopeful that it can take us back to kind of a more normal rotation, but right now we really don't have any idea what that looks like.
Okay. So the next question here, are you seeing higher infection rates in certain soil zones over others?
So I can actually refer back to the ministry surveys for pea and lentil, where they do root rot assessments. In 2023, for example, we are tending to see higher incidence and severity in the western part of the province. So west central, northwest in particular, there's really high pressure in our pea and lentil fields. That being said, soil types with heavy clay component that are prone to compaction are also will confound and add to those infection levels. So when we look at the frequency of pea and lentil acres in those soil zones in those areas of the province, they have typically been our large pulse producing acres, western Saskatchewan, and so all the way up southwest right up to northwest, which is frequency of pea and lentil and rotation is one of the key components of building that inoculum. So I think it's hard to separate both of them, but when we have all of those factors satisfied, host, pathogen, and conditions, you're going to have an infection. So any clay soil is really susceptible, and where you have a high frequency where there's a host crop in there. And unfortunately, it's been Western Saskatchewan thus far.
Yeah. Okay, the next one. Chickpeas are resistant to Aphanomyces, but do they still act as a host for Aphanomyces?
So chickpeas are resistant. They will not contribute actively to building your Aphanomyces oospore inoculum in the soil.
Okay. Now into some soil sampling questions. So what's the best time to soil sample for root rot? And then is it possible to do that sampling in the fall, the season before, to help make decisions for next year's pulse crop?
Ideally, for management decision making, it would be done in the fall. So if you want to confirm that you have a root rot infection and you have a crop that's showing symptomology, I would honestly go in and collect plants and submit the plants to have DNA extracted. That's essentially what we do with a bait test. We plant a seedling in soil that we think has disease in it, we get it up to field capacity, and then we extract the DNA from the roots of that plant. So when you sample in season and take plant samples, you're just bypassing having to do the bait test portion, the soil collection portion. So if you can do that in season to confirm what you're seeing, great. If you want to use soil sampling as a management decision-making tool, I would pair that with your risk assessment evaluation, use the area app, but definitely you can go in the fall, take a soil sample like we showed in the video, and submit it for a bait test. And at least talk to the lab and see what their report structure is. Is it a yes, no? Yes, I have a Phanomyces, no, I don't. Or do they actually give you a quantified number of oospores per gram of soil? And a threshold for seeing risk for infection occurring up visually in plants is about 100 grams of 100 oospores per gram of soil.
Okay. So the next question we have here is the majority of the damage from Fusarium or a Phanomyces? Will limiting Fusarium damage prevent a Phanomyces infection?
Mike, we've run out of time here, but if you guys are able to briefly answer these, this is the last one, and then we have to wrap up.
Okay. Okay. We don't know. Fusarium and Phanomyces occur so often together. Limiting Fusarium infections will help the plant be more resilient and resistant to fighting off an Phanomyces infection. So the more you can limit the number of pathogens that are waging war on your roots, the better chance that plant has of fighting off one individual pathogen, if that makes sense. In some cases, it's Fusarium that's doing all of the damage. In others, it's a Phanomyces. Lots of times it's both together and they tag team that crop.
So is that everything, Jasmine, or do you want us to finish the other two really quick that are up there?
That's everything. If you wanted to add any additional color to those questions, we can include them in the post event email.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating and taking part in our webinar. And we sincerely appreciate you sticking it out with us with the technical difficulties. Thank you so much. The recording from today will be posted on our website and the YouTube channel. You will also receive an email with links to the recording, as well as additional resources and a survey to collect your feedback. Your opinion is really important to us, and it helps us deliver valuable extension opportunities and continuously improve SPG's content and material. Thank you. Have a great day and good luck, everyone, this growing season.